And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to episode number 11 of UnSpun with myself, Jan Irvin, and Joe Atwill, my handsome co-host. And Joe and I have an exciting show for all of you tonight. And this is a subject that I've wanted to broach for several weeks now, and I think it's about time. And this is going to go... Well, we're going to be discussing damaged goods and what that means, damaged goods, as far as looking out into Huxley's Mad New World and seeing the damage out there in the wake of it, as well as tracing the history back all the way to Edward Bernay's. And Joe and I touched on some of this back when we co-authored Manufacturing the Deadhead in 2013. So now that we've pieced together so much more, I think now we can paint a nice picture in hindsight. And hopefully tonight I won't have any snowstorms or earthquakes like the last couple of episodes.
Hopefully. Yeah, well, Edward Bernay is a bizarre individual. He is the father of propaganda. This is his own claim. And he saw propaganda as useful for the functioning of society. In other words, he basically saw a structure of elites using mind control to basically shape democracy. And this was somehow acceptable to Edward Bernays, and actually something that he claimed was useful for mankind. Bernays has a strange family connection to Sigmund Freud. He is a double nephew, which is to say that both of his parents were related into Freud's family. His mother was Freud's sister, and his father, Eli Bernays, was the brother of Freud's wife. So it's a small world, isn't it? Freud and Bernays maintained a constant communication during their life. Some of the letters have been published, some have not. It's clear that Freud's psychological theorizing, particularly that part of it which had to do with social groups, was tremendously influential on Bernays. And when we talk about damaged goods, and the damaged goods of the people who wander our world, who have basically been taken into a debased condition by culture. All of these individuals really can trace the devastation of their personal lives to Edward Bernays. If you look at the counterculture, as it appeared in the 60s, we have to remember that, culture is never static. It's always in motion. And when we got to the 60s and Woodstock, we saw that there had been a tremendous change in a number of areas. There were overt sexual images that were now permitted in the popular media. In fact, pornography was beginning to really take hold in American culture in 1966, 67. You had this wild and uninhibited dancing. Now, this was something that definitely didn't exist in the 40s and 50s, certainly not back when Bernays was beginning his career in the start of the 20th century. Music idols, think of the power of, people like Jim Morrison and the Beatles and the Grateful Dead. They had become basically like religious, personages that could lead people to different kinds of beliefs. Feminism had come into play, and you had the sexual revolution, which was being promoted as part of sort of the overall sexual context of culture. This was completely different than what had existed in the 50s, in the 40s, and certainly at the beginning of the 20th century. Integration was something that was now seen as really beneficial, something positive to culture. Of course, this is totally different than as would have been understood in early part of the 20th century. And of course, psychedelic drug use and drug use in general. So these are, all of the elements of change that had come about in the 20th century. And amazingly, they can all be traced back to Edward Bernay's. He was involved in the origin of every single one of these things. And I don't think this is possibly something that could be accidental. These are very different and all very powerful structural changes in our culture. And for someone to have been at the origin of all of these things can only have been, basically the beginning of a plan. Culture moves very slowly. And when Bernays began the project, which was a multi-generational project, right, to bring about this debasement of our culture, he couldn't go to pornography or wildly uninhibited dancing, or even integration in the sense of interracial marriage, for example. Those would have been impossible things in the early part of the 20th century. So he just sort of started each of these processes going and took them as far as culture would permit at the time. He changed culture to the extent that he could. In terms of pornography, he produced a play called Damaged Goods. And
right.
Jan, can you tell us about this play?
Well, sure. Damaged Goods is actually from a French book by Eugene Brieux, and that was published possibly a play put out in 1901, and then that became Damaged Lives. And, I guess I could share the screen here. That might be a little more helpful. But so he's got this guy here writes Les Averies, 1901, and that's Eugene Brieux. That's this guy here. And so let's see. So it was a play. And anyway, so this play becomes Damaged Lives, and Damaged Lives put out in 1933. Pre-code exploitation film by Columbia Pictures, and then that becomes Damaged Goods from 1919, or actually the other way around. Damaged Lives came out of Damaged Goods. But this starred Richard Bennett, who was one of the actors in it, directors of it, and Tom Ricketts. And so Richard Bennett, when we pull him up, again, he's got this, same background, following stage, etc. And he actually grows up in Cass County, Indiana, but eldest child of George Washington Bennett and Eliza Leonora Bennett. His younger sister, Alana Bennett. Anyway, so this is who this Damaged Goods idea stems from, is this group of people. And there was this one also, Adrian Morrison, who is married to Richard Bennett, the actor there. And I believe that's Richard Bennett shown in the link there for Damaged and I just pulled up the wrong one. Damaged Goods up, and it's this guy here, I think, is him, and that small picture right there. So that is my guess anyway of who that is.
Right, I'm sure that is the case. And so Damaged Goods was really it was in a way the beginning of pornography. Before this play was produced, there had really been very strict guidelines, and the theater and film were both self-regulating. In other words, there was the Legion of Honor I forget, maybe I'm getting it wrong, but there was a Roman Catholic organization that monitored film and plays, and they had a rating system, and if the play was overtly sexual, they would rate it condemned, and that would basically end its commercial viability. So that was how basically wholesome the culture was at this time. But Bernay's got very powerful friends to help him. The Rockefeller family and the Roosevelts, both of whom attended the premiere night, play of of Damaged Goods, and the brain will probably show us all of these kinds of connections. But okay, so and then the New York Times chimed in, and I think you can see the connection now of media control, because instead of basically supporting wholesome non-sexualized films and theater, the New York Times came in and said this was such a terrific thing, and then declared that it was sex o'clock in America, kind of a.
And Joe and I have shown that audio clip in the past, which can be found on the Gnostic Media website if people want to search Edward Bernay's. There is a talk up there, and I also play the same clip in the Psychedelic Intelligence video on the Gnostic Media website, where Edward Bernays is actually discussing how how the New York Times came out, or one of those newspapers, saying that it was sex o'clock in America, and he's bragging about this.
Right, and people will say, "Well, gee, Joe and Jan, you guys aren't very modern and very hip.
Right.
Be so critical of something that seems so, but not, sort of low key." But the fact is, we have to look at this in the context of where culture has gone, because there is a direct relationship between this play and Miley Cyrus. When you see, and also just the completely overt pornography on the internet, which is just overwhelming the sexuality of America, and I think really making relationships difficult. Jan had someone whose name I forget, but I'm sure Jan remembers, who had done studies into pornography, and he took the position that
Gary Wilson,
thank you, and he had research showing that this was damaging real sexual relations, that it was damaging romance. In other words, the kind of love connection between people from which relationships and family can stem, that pornography was interfering with this dramatically. And so when you look at Damaged Goods and see there the technique and science of modern psychology, or Tavistock psychology, let's call it, with Sigmund Freud and Edward Bernays, and you see the Rockefeller family promoting it, I mean, this should be a really clear red flag to everyone that there is a potential for a nefarious cultural event here. And so that article that Jan has on the screen now, Manufacturing the Deadhead, this goes in good detail to Bernays' activities. And
well, let's just read this quote, for the audience who has not read at least Bernays' book Propaganda. He starts off on page 1 of his book Propaganda stating, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. This is the logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized." Of course, this is spin and propaganda that he's using to sell his spin and propaganda. Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate in this manner if they are to live together in a smoothly functioning society. Of course, as slaves, in almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind. And of course, this is all about control and manipulation. He's not talking about the trivium method, which I think Joe and I talked about in episode 2 of UnSpun. He's not talking about uplifting anyone, empowering anyone, showing the public how this stuff works. He's talking about manipulating them and controlling them for the elite and himself, Gordon Wasson, Timothy Leary, Ken Kesey, the whole of the CIA, et cetera. This is what these sociopaths do.
Exactly. And a couple points. One is Bernay was a close friend and a colleague of Gordon Wasson.
Absolutely. So on the screen here.
Right.
Well, I can, let me just pull that up here and if I can find it again. But we do have, on a hunch, I researched Edward Bernay's, maybe I published that in the previous article, but in one of the articles, it could be the first one I published. Edward Bernay's exposes that he had been friends with Wasson for at least a decade. And that's Gordon Wasson right there with the so-called discoverer of magic mushrooms, with the so-called inventor of LSD, Albert Hofmann. Of course, in my opinion, it appears that Albert Hofmann creating LSD is a complete joke, and it appears that Arthur Stoll actually invented it to cover up 20 years of human experiments. They passed the invention on to Albert Hofmann. But Bernay's, and there's that same quote again. If I can just find the other one here. Here we go.
Okay, let me just interject something. When you read Bernays' quote, you have to remember that what he is really doing is trying to normalize, trying to make the mind numb in regards to propaganda. He's basically just giving a kind of rationale that is just raw. It's not just sophistry, because the argument logically makes no sense at all, but it's mind control. He's saying, look, this is just the way it is. It's for your benefit, so don't think about it, don't complain about it. That's really the message that statement gives. And you have to, think about Bernays as the individual that brings about the counterculture, or he was one of the originators of it. Woodstock, pornography, the destruction of the family. These are his achievements, and these were the goals. So that's how, when you read through Bernays' advertisements for himself, you need to keep those points in mind, that this is someone who was, just absolutely destructive to our culture.
Absolutely. And he would be, he would think that your statement there, as would the CIA, they would all think that this was some great achievement. Anything that destroys society, that pushes people down, pushes them back, dumbs people down, etc., they all think that's an achievement. So Edward Bernay's, and this, I found this from the U.S. Library of Congress, and it was on a hunch alone that I contacted them, because I realized that propaganda was just coming about, and Wasson was the vice president of communications for J.P. Morgan Bank, which is a polite way of saying propaganda or public relations. And so Edward Bernay's, and this is from the letter from the U.S. Library of Congress, Gordon Wasson was one of those newspapermen who consciously or unconsciously recognized the implications of the contacts he made in that capacity. He found these contacts important, outstanding. This led to places and other things. In the New York Tribune financial department, he had made contact with the house on the corner, Broad and Wall, J.P. Morgan. Then he had given up newspaper work and become associated with the home, that's J.P. Morgan's house on the corner. First, he was in the publicity department. When Martin Egan died, he assumed the function of publicity man with J. Pierpont Morgan. He was highly respected by his own people. He was intelligent, smooth. His mind was highly, splendidly geared, functioning mechanism. In other words, he was a psychopath and he was a good liar and manipulator. Wasson made it his business, and he got pleasure out of it too, of associating with a broad segment of society. This was not unimportant in maintaining contacts for the house on the corner with the rest of the world. Not until long after I knew him did I find out in Professor Raymond Mosley's book, The First 7 Years, published in 1939, a reference to Gordon Wasson. Mosley wrote in a memo in 1934 that and made recommendations for the Stock Exchange Commission membership, which I have listed just below down here. It is all listed there. But anyway, he goes on. Next to Gordon Wasson, whom he recommended, he added, a resident of New Jersey, handled foreign securities for Guarantee Company, has acted as liaison between Wall Street, Landis, Cohen, and Corcoran because his friendship with them was known downtown. Knows security business and the act thoroughly, having helped in its drafting. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, the stock exchange and all of that, Wasson is one of the key people who helped draft the original act for that. So all of this nonsense that goes on and the crashing of society and stuff, Wasson, and everybody knows J.P. Morgan is behind that, but Wasson was largely behind that as well. And then he says, very well liked by Treasury and Commerce, would certainly be recommended by the Guarantee and Stock Exchange, and therefore would be acceptable to Wall Street. And then Bernay concludes with, I saw Wasson very often between 1934 and 44. I never had the slightest inkling that he had been thought of for this position. His conversation was bland, never personal, always on the most general subjects.
Right. Well, that's just wonderful. Anyone who really wants to understand Gordon Wasson, you just go to the 1957 Life magazine, May 1957, and read the story he wrote, which he neglects to point out that in his discovery of magic mushrooms that he is actually operating as a sub-project of MK Ultra.
Subproject 58.
Subproject 58. And then when you read the article, notice that his description of his introduction to the wonders of mushrooms, he uses typology to create a fictional story. The typology is based upon the story of Adam and Eve being kicked out of the Garden of Paradise. I mean, this guy is a high-level psychopath. And anyone who could do what he did, anyone who could go to Mexico, write this story that was obviously done to introduce psychosis-producing drugs into the general culture, is just completely beyond the pale of anything that can be called civilized. So when you read Bernay's pumping this guy, right? And remember, Bernay's would have well known what Wasson was up to. Bernay's would have known all of this. So what you're seeing is he's promoting Bernay's as a human being with the idea of getting the MK Ultra drug project well established. That's the whole reason that Bernay's is promoting Wasson's stable and intelligent mind. So what we're dealing with is a vast organization, thousands of people who are knitted together in a way which we need to get to the bottom of. We need to understand if it is an ethnic or religious connection or what exactly holds,
or simply secret societies and brotherhoods and blood bonds.
What is it? We need to know. But the thing is that because they have this ability to lie, create these projects, and then keep this hidden from the public, it takes researchers to ferret out exactly what they're doing. They've been able to extend all through our government. And
yes.
so that's why it's so important to have the citizen alerted to this fact, because you can't just have, you know, 2 researchers working on this or 1,000. We need tens of thousands of people because they control the media. You see, it's really clear when you go through this, Sean. You can see that the New York Times was in lockstep with their promotion of sex o'clock in America.
Absolutely.
So that means that newspaper is dirty, right? Now, the New York Times was owned, and I'm not sure if at that time this pair owned it, but they may have. You have August Belmont and Jerome. Jerome was the father of the wife of Winston Churchill. August Belmont was the U.S. financial representative of the Rothschild family. So you need to kind of explore these connections to see what exactly is being, you know, planned, designed, and promoted by these media operations, because it ends up with, you know, psychotic producing drugs being sold as spiritual tonic and recreation to America's children, right? So this is at a level of evil and of dangerous evil. You know, it's because it's still in operation that we just have to expose it as quickly as we can. And so I hope that anyone that would read the article, Manufacturing the Deadhead, read the articles there at the Gnostic Media site, and, you know, find this line of reasoning coherent. Please join in the fight. We need this is an all hands, all women work party. Everyone needs to be, once you've identified that this society or this organization of societies is in fact engaged in mass cultural destruction and mass genocide, because that's one follows the other, then we are just required, you know, as beings who wish to have, you know, defend ourselves, to work as hard as we can to expose the society, to expose the organization and the connections that hold all this in place. And so, you know, Bernay's is a, you know, seminal piece, but he was helped. You can see already it's multi-generational. You can see the fact that if you look at the connections from his uncle Sigmund Freud, right? You can see from, and Freud's connection into Tavistock, you can see that already that it's multi-generational, that it wasn't, that Bernay's didn't start the project. The project was already ongoing.
Well, you know, and even just to interject there, Joe, it didn't, I mean, we can trace all of this to Bernay's, but he's not the only one. Before him, we had Thomas Henry Huxley and others as well, exactly, going all the way back. So
exactly. And so this is what we have. I mean, you can see that high-level Freemasonry is involved. You can see that there is a control over military intelligence. You can see other secret societies like Bohemian Grove and Skull and Bones are involved. And there is a relationship between all these organizations, you know, and there are times when it's just completely vivid. One time where the organization of the different secret societies is vivid is in the group The Grateful Dead, because there you have Freemasonry, the Bohemian Grove, military intelligence, and Tavistock, right, are all unified. And then and then joining with that group are the banking families, the Cargills and the Mellons. So when you attend a Grateful Dead concert in the 1960s, you were literally sitting in about the most concentrated nexus of secret society, military intelligence, and oligarchic control that was possible. And the kids who are sitting there listening to this nonsense, these music things that people are coming up with, they thought that this was a kind of rebellion, you see.
Right. And it was totally manufactured.
Right. You can
Joe, what I want to do, Joe, is I want to play the clip of Edward Bernay's talking from my psychedelic intelligence video. And this is seconds after you finish speaking. And then I also want to play the clip of Bob Weir from Bohemian Grove. It may take me a few seconds to find that.
Oh, that's a great idea because this is so clarifying. Yeah.
And hopefully,
I was interested in all
can you
kinds
hear that?
of social
Yes, very clear.
affairs, not societal affairs, but social affairs that had to do with a better society. And so I wrote Bennett and said, the editors of the Medical Review of Reviews will be glad to support you in your effort to produce this play. Because at that time, there was a man in New York, Anthony Comstock, who fought anything having to do with anything that might be considered to be slightly off color. And venereal disease was more than off color. It couldn't be mentioned in any society, polite or otherwise.
Very bold undertaking for that period, really.
So I wrote to this actor who was the father of Joan Bennett, whom you've seen on the screen, and signed it the editors. I'd learned that from the Atlantic Monthly, which always signed its letters, the editors. And next morning, there was a telephone call from Richard Bennett, will you come up to the Lambs Club and have lunch with me? I want to talk to the editors. And I said, I'm the editors. So I came up and had lunch with him. And after that lunch, I decided, and my associate, who was 22 years old, agreed, that we would organize the Medical Review of Reviews Sociological Fund. We would charge $4 for admission to the fund, and that the $4 would give you the opportunity to see Damaged Goods performed by Richard Bennett and a company. And in order to build up this to have status in New York at the time, we got John D. Rockefeller Jr., who was interested in fighting venereal disease, and Abram Flexner and others to become members of the Medical Review of Reviews Sociological Fund. And before we knew it, this performance went on. And incidentally, I found out later by looking at the list of those who were present that Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his wife, Eleanor, were present.
Both in the audience.
Just
both
shocker.
in the audience.
Oh my God.
This play, which was performed in New York at the Gaiety Theater, made such a terrific sensation that next day the newspapers were full of it, and one man sagely observed, it has struck 6 o'clock in America. At this point...
What year was this?
1913.
So
All right, so that's the little clip, and then I'm going to take a minute here to find the next clip of Bob Weir. But what we're getting at here, ladies and gentlemen, is all of this traitor Gloria Steinem's feminism stuff out there. All of this, it's not as Bernay's is spinning it to, bring awareness to venereal disease. The idea is really to get people talking and thinking about sex constantly. So what you saw Edward Bernay's discussing and doing then with Damaged Goods becomes Miley Cyrus and the porn industry and Larry Flint and all of this stuff, Playboy, all of this stuff that we see today, internet pornography. That what you just saw was the very first initial candlelight of essentially of what we see today, and that's not even a good term. The first little sliver of this nonsense, that they promote the Great Society.
Let me just interject. I mean, first of all, the idea that that striking sex o'clock in America would somehow reduce venereal disease is oxymoronic. I mean, so you can see right off the bat, there's a problem with the general thesis they're trying to sell. This would be completely confirmed by the just raw data. Venereal disease has basically gone up as a percentage of the population being infected with it every year since then, until now you have situations where like half of college students have one venereal disease or another. And this traces directly from this sex o'clock in America.
Right. And just to interject, Joe, Hans and I in the series on music and mind control showed a junior high where the 8th graders had like 10% of the 8th graders had venereal disease.
Right. So it really is sex o'clock in America. And then the other thing is, notice that just Bernay's is just lying his head off because, I mean, and even by his admission, in other words, he talks about setting up these bogus organizations like the editors and then the Society of Sociologic Review. He's actually describing just inventing powerful titles and organizations out of thin air to intimidate people, to give him more status. He's really giving you a kind of insight into how he actually functions. In other words,
right.
The guy is the Wizard of Oz, and he's just making everything up because he knows that people can't defend themselves against such lies. In other words, he sets himself up as if you played the tape again, the Society of Sociology, I forget the name of it, but it's
right. Well, and he says that he creates it with his 22-year-old partner. I mean, how many 22-year-olds are hanging around dreaming crap like this up?
Right. And so, but you can see that he's, Bernays is a kind of warrior for the organization. He's a weapon. He's designed to destroy culture. He's been trained in it. And so,
make sure you're there in camera, Joe.
Right. And so this is what you have going on with Bernays, and it's really not that hard. These conclusions may seem like they're extraordinary, but I'm telling you, if you follow the data, you can come to these. Any reasonable person will come to the same conclusion.
And read Bernays' book. Read the surrounding research that we've put out, the citations, et cetera. Look at this stuff.
And when you look at Bernays' work in an overall context, it's obviously all designed to start moving culture toward Woodstock, toward the sexual revolution, toward the music idol cults, toward psychedelic drugs. And so this culture moves very slowly. This was how, as you pointed out, the turn began. It starts here, and then you start heading in a bad direction. And believe me, every statistic starts turning negative once this boat gets headed in the direction that they want us to take us.
All right, so let's play this clip now with Bob Weir of the Grateful Dead, and this is another quite good one. And here we go.
What insights can you share with us about your performance at the Bohemian Grove?
Well, I'll tell you what, I don't talk much about the Bohemian Grove because, it's a place that people go to get away from the spotlight. A lot of relatively well-known guys are members of that club. Basically, it was founded 130 years ago or so by artists and writers, for artists and writers. And still, in order to get in, you have to have something to offer in that regard. A lot of the members are successful entrepreneurs or businessmen of one sort or another, but they all have an artistic bent. The stuff you hear about it in the rumor mill is, while entertaining, I've never caught any original sacrifices. Anything kind of remotely like that. He's had some interesting times up there. And there are a lot of movers and shakers in that club, and I enjoy the chance, given my mindset, my Weltschmerz, if you will. I enjoy a chance to get to get together with those guys and knock a couple back and talk it down. One time I spent a weekend up there. I ran into a guy named General Bill Quinn. And we had a couple drinks together. We were sitting in front of a fireplace. And we just started telling, we fell in together, and we started telling, war stories. He was the guy that Hermann Goering surrendered, not his sword, but basically it was a mace. He surrendered he sought out Bill Quinn, Wild Bill Quinn, who was also the original head of the OSS, which became the CIA. He was a very, very interesting guy.
Yeah.
Just went back and forth. We had a crowd of people gathered around us at all times. And we'd about late afternoon, we'd wander onto the deck where the fireplace was, sit down, grab a couple of drinks, and just start going back and forth. That kind of stuff, these kinds of meetings and stuff like that are only going to happen there. Or, it's the only place where you can almost be assured of, where I can almost be assured of meeting folks like this. So it's a great opportunity for me. It's also a great club. There's a sort of an unwritten but hard and fast rule for membership: no jerks. And they have an entrance committee that they can sniff them out.
Well, Bob, those are great.
All right, so that's that clip. And I should bring up that I had somebody send me some information today on Jeff Baxter. And of course, Jeff Baxter is from the Doobie Brothers and Steely Dan, and he is Pentagon intelligence and et cetera. And there's, we have the same stuff. But anyway, what we're getting at is, the Grateful Dead peddled the wild sex and drugs. They and their earlier name, the Warlocks, were the musicians for the acid test for Ken Kesey that we discussed last week. And here we see Bob Weir and these guys yucking it up about their time at Bohemian Grove, hanging out with the original general or head of the OSS, which became the CIA, et cetera. So this is, who the Grateful Dead really are. This is the behind the scenes information that they don't want you to know. And then when we see Sue Palakis and Vito Palakis out creating the freak dance and the freak dress and all this stuff that they promoted, and the whole, it's all just selling degradation, and it's getting people to think they're rebelling while the CIA and intelligence community is actually manufacturing that rebellion. So they're creating the second group or multiple different groups that people are going to break off and go into to think that they're rebelling against straight so-called society, when in fact they're being entirely controlled and manipulated. So again, with just as with Bob Weir, another instance here I want to show very quickly is Jeff Baxter. And he's repeatedly discusses his work in intelligence. And I've got another episode here. Pull up the right one. I just pulled up the same one twice, unfortunately. But one of these shows Jeff as working with the intel community. And what did I do? I just pulled the same one, wrong one up several times or something. So this is actually Jeff Baxter of the Doobie Brothers and Steely Dan discussing his work with the intelligence community. Of course, it's all tongue-in-cheek, just like with Bob Weir, just like with the rest of them. And of course, Dave McGowan, who we discussed a couple of weeks ago, is one of the originals who started making these connections. But all of this is the intelligence community. The intelligence community, they are manufacturing the damaged goods. When you look out in society and you see people with the big holes in their ears and the and the tattoos and the dress, and they're not getting on in their lives, and they're into all of this, navel gazing and pillow sitting, etc., thinking that they're being spiritual. This is all the creation of the intelligence community. Alan Watts, and I've repeatedly shown this in my work, Alan Watts, the famous hippie philosopher who promoted Hinduism and Buddhism, etc., was actually recruited to MK Ultra. It appears on October 17, 1952 by the letters of Aldous Huxley. And in the letters of Aldous Huxley, he's talking about the, now I'm forgetting, it's in my Spies in Academic Clothing article about what Watts's agenda was there. And then, of course, Watts took the double bind, and Joe and I with Bill Jocelyn and Ryan and one of the episodes that we did on Remedy Roundtable here, and people can go to this page on the Gnostic Media website, and we have all of the Remedy Roundtables. I think it was episode 1 or 2. We discussed the double bind and how that was used for social control, and how guys like Watts peddled this stuff for the CIA to screw people up. The goal was essentially to get people caught in meditation and navel gazing rather than real action and political protest and movements.
I want one thing that, the organizations that do damage, I think it's true to say that the focus is military intelligence, because there is the greatest amount of secrecy that basically that organization can hide behind. In order to destroy people and destroy cultures, you need secrecy to basically set up the process of, you can't alert people that you're doing it. And so the secret societies of military intelligence are part of it. And I'm just going to digress and point out that Bob Weir, who was there in the Bohemian Grove, his father, I found out, was another Annapolis grad, just like Jim Morrison's father. But they also use other secret societies. They are related to, for example, like the Tavistock, which I think would be sort of the umbrella that Freud and Bernay's come from. Skull and Bones, you can see
Well, don't go too far. Let's not forget about Eric Trist and Alan Trist, who we brought up before, but we see Alan Trist up here. Who's Alan Trist? Well, Alan Trist is the son of Eric Trist. Eric Trist founded the Tavistock Institute. Alan Trist was the manager and promoter of the Grateful Dead. And you can see many of the Grateful Dead's intelligence connections right here.
Right. So we have a combination of organizations with some freelance individuals, because Bernay's, I think, is hard to really to pin down as to which organization he might be under the umbrella, though I presume it would be Tavistock. But you have an overarching structure that contains these societies and organizes them. And so military intelligence, I think, is more the focus of it, because that organization has the greatest shield of secrecy. I think for many centuries, the Freemasons were the premier organization. And then, bear in mind that when you look at these organizations, when you try to determine, well, how does the structure permit this kind of destruction of society, and how does it keep that something so evil secret? If you look at the Freemasons, they have levels, and there are basically a defense against finding out what the insiders are up to of all of these individuals who are at these lower levels. And I think that the CIA and Bohemian Grove, and I think all of the secret societies that are engaged in this and are related to another would have the same structure, that there would be people inside them, like, for example, inside the CIA, that would not be dirty, but rather would just be there as a kind of defense against the public looking in and seeing only a collection of individuals that were engaged in cultural destruction. You know, what they look in when they see the CIA is they see, well, this person was, I know him, he was a member of the CIA, therefore the CIA cannot be doing these activities. I'm sorry, but they have structures, they have levels, and the higher levels will have the things that have to be kept secret. So, and then getting back to Weir's point, one thing that always amuses me is he talks about Quinn, and notice he says, well, you know, it's founded by artists and writers.
Artists and writers for artists and writers.
And that everyone has to have some kind of relationship into this, even the entrepreneurs or have this code of conduct. Well, then he gives an example of the persons that he meets as the head of the OSS. I mean, what kind of artist or literature?
Sure. Well, and let me add there that the Bohemian Grove, which comes out of the Bohemian Club in San Francisco, is the sister organization for the Century Club in New York. And I have repeatedly shown that the Century Club in New York was headed by Alan Dulles. And Alan Dulles, he worked directly with Gordon Wasson. And I have numerous letters from Alan Dulles approving various members. And when I was at the Firestone Library at Princeton University in September, I basically found a whole cache of Alan Dulles's approval letters of members to the Century Club. And then, of course, like I said, the Bohemian Club actually stems out of the Century Club. So here's the Bohemian Club out of it. And again, direct connections with the intelligence community. We had a large number of people hanging out at the Century Club. Robert Forty admits that he hung out there with Gordon Wasson. Gordon Wasson, the so-called discoverer of magic mushrooms, working with the CIA and Council on Foreign Relations. I have documentation that shows letters between Gordon Wasson and Carlos Castaneda. That Castaneda was hanging out at the Century Club with all of these people. Of course, Alan Richardson, the photographer for Gordon Wasson's so-called magic mushroom trips in Mexico, he was also a member there. And so all of these things stem around the Century Club, the Bohemian Club, the intelligence agencies. And I want to add to, and while it might be a little bit broad a statement, there appears in general no difference between the occult and the intelligence community, between these secret societies and the intelligence community. For instance, Aleister Crowley was MI6. He founds the OTO. Aldous Huxley, he's into all of this occult, all promoting all of this stuff. He's MI6 and CIA, and the chief or in charge of MK Ultra. And last week I discovered that Leonard George Holden Huxley was in charge of MK Ultra Australia. And, so there's more connections there, even into global intelligence and global mind control work. But all of this stuff always ties right back together. We never have to go too far before we get back to these peddlers of damaged goods. And I think, Joe, that's a great segue to go into some of what you found regarding One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. We've got about 7 minutes left, so I want to pass that over to you.
Thank you. Well, I have an article, two articles, analyzing Catcher in the Rye. And in one of them, I show that the book is a cryptic description of a series of Freemason initiations and also processing rituals to go higher and higher through the organization. And I show that Salinger claims that inside of Freemasonry, at its core, its secret, is a violent genocidal impulse that they want to, and as Salinger characterized it, F you, and I won't use the obscenity, but that is really what is the deep secret of Freemasonry, that basically it's it hates and wishes to commit violence against everyone else in the world. I mean, basically, as Salinger sets it up with his cryptic symbolism, it's going to genocide the planet, leaving only this organization there. And then the other article I wrote is called, in that article is Freemason in the Rye. The other article is called Pedophile in the Rye, and it shows that Salinger actually engaged using the book as a weapon against culture. So he not only made the representation that, we're going to hurt people, he actually then went out and damaged people with the book. He used a technique called neuro-linguistic programming, which was developed by people who later became part of MK Ultra. All right, so
right, that's Carl Rogers, and that was MK Ultra's sub-project 97, I believe.
Right, and so anyway, this shows the kind of structure of the literature that we've been force-fed. How it is both a vanity piece, which creates legacy.
Sorry about that.
But creates legacy for the people who they want to record what they're doing, but they also use it to damage us. Now, last week we discussed Ken Kesey, and I have gotten a hold of a copy of this little work. This is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I read it today, and I can guarantee everyone that if you are familiar with the typology that these people use.
And that, Joe, that you have been exposing for a decade.
That's right, that I have been exposing. That, and I'm going to write an article which will show that this book is basically in the same genre of Salinger's work, that it both records the Freemason plot, it creates legacy for this, and also for other organizations, because it's not just Freemasonry that he's referring to. Because remember, Ken Kesey was involved with Tavistock, he was involved with the CIA, he was involved with Bohemian Grove. I mean, these were all individuals that were inside the cluster.
Well, we don't know if Kesey had ties to Bohemian Grove per se, do we?
Well, he had ties in the sense that he was promoting the Grateful Dead. Now that would be the connection I'd be referring to. When you go to the acid test that he creates, you're bringing together like Alexander Shulgin, who is a Bohemian Grove member, who is the chemist who was then giving the LSD to the Grateful Dead.
Sasha, yes.
Okay, so this is what is recorded in it. And then the other thing is, the book is a weapon. The book is designed to make the conclusion where the Indian chief Bromden goes back to nature to be the trip that the young American middle class readers of the book will take. So I'll be exposing this in an article that will be on the Gnostic Media website and also postslaviana.org. But I just wanted to underline this because we had questions about it last week. And then the final point is just, I've gotten a lot of emails from people all asking the audio tape that Kesey made and owns. People have pointed out that all of the MK Ultra documents were subpoenaed by the Church Commission in the 70s. They were unable to get anything because Kemp had destroyed them. There was a small collection of MK Ultra documents, including Gordon Wasson's pay requisition, that were discovered just by accident, basically. But the emails have all asked the same question. If Kesey had this material, how did he get it? And secondly, why was it not given to the Church Commission for analysis in 1970 when they were desperate to get their hands on MK Ultra material? So if Zane wants to come on the show, these are two questions that I think we can ask him.
Now, another thing that I want to point out is that Salinger's Catcher in the Rye and Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and so many others are required reading in high school. And then we begin to see the real agenda as to why this crap is required reading.
Exactly.
And ladies and gentlemen, that's a wrap for Unspun number 11. I'm Jan Irvin, GnosticMedia.com. Please support the show. Also support the network, CCN, the Conscious Consumer Network. And Joe, your website?
CaesarsMessiah.com. Buy the books. I think you'll find them enjoyable. Postflaviana.org. You can get the Shakespeare book there. And I'd like to answer any questions. And support Gnostic Media and CCN because, believe me, we need a freer media than the one we have. Good night, everybody. See you later. See you next week.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning into CCN. This unique network is dedicated to free and independent media. CCN was created with the belief that information is the common heritage of all beings, which is why our live stream high-definition broadcast is easily accessible and free to view. If we want to change the world, we must first change the media. Having produced over 1,000 shows in 2015, which are all archived on YouTube, we look forward to bringing you more groundbreaking, cutting-edge information in 2016. For more information on what is on, please check out our broadcast guide for weekly updates. CCN broadcasts in multiple languages and features some key voices of our challenging times who are all in pursuit of a free, fair, just, sustainable world. CCN belongs to you, the people, and it is up to you all to keep this network on the air. Please contribute to the Network Support Fund or visit the CCN shop. We thank you all for supporting free and independent media.